Okay, everyone, welcome back to Unit 12. The nation begins to crack, the sectional crisis of the 1840s. Just to kind of review, we've broken this unit into three parts. Part one we've already dealt with, and that was the Texas Revolution. The importance of that, of course, was the consequences and the debate that arose within the United States over the annexation of Texas. We're going to discuss more of that in part two. In part two, which we're going to focus on in this lecture, we're going to discuss the Mexican-American War. And then in part three, the next lecture, we'll discuss the crisis of the Union and the Compromise of 1850. But this is the Mexican-American War. And the way we're going to approach the Mexican-American War is we're briefly going to talk about the causes of this war. Once we have a good understanding of what brings the war about, we're going to get into a discussion about the major campaigns and the battles of the war, then a discussion about the treaty that ends the Mexican-American War, and then ultimately why was this war significant. But let's start with the causes of the war. The causes of the war really come down to a few things. One is a very important presidential election that took place in 1844 that will involve this idea of manifest destiny, but also the annexation of Texas and the boundaries of Texas are going to help bring about the Mexican War. But let's focus on that first one, the election of 1844. Guys, by 1844, Texas had existed now as an independent nation since 1836, and throughout that time period, Texas was the single biggest issue being debated in the nation. The question was, should we annex it, should we not annex it? The Southern attitude towards the annexation of Texas was very much in the affirmative. Southerners were very much in favor of the United States annexing Texas because this would be adding another slave state to the Union. It would be allowing Southerners to increase a little bit their control and their voice within the government. The Northern attitude was very negative towards the annexation of Texas. They believed that the Texas Revolution was simply a conspiracy to add another slave state to the Union, that it was perpetrated by slaveholders themselves, and that adding Texas to the Union would be allowing slavery to expand, something that we will again be seeing in this lecture, that Northerners are now very much concerned about slavery's expansion and are now beginning to seek ways to limit the expansion of slavery. And adding Texas to the Union would be then allowing slavery to expand. So going into this presidential election of 1844, the single biggest issue facing the nation was the annexation of Texas. Do we annex it or do we not? Southerners in favor of it, Northerners against it. Now, knowing that's the single biggest issue, it would be logical then to assume that the candidates for both of the parties in the election of 1844 would want to take a position on this issue. So let's talk about the presumptive candidates for both of the parties in the presidential election of 1844. It was believed that Henry Clay would win the nomination for the Whig Party, a belief that did in fact become reality. For the Democratic Party, it was believed that Martin Van Buren, he had been the vice president of Andrew Jackson. He had already actually been president of the United States. And it was believed in the election of 1844 that he would be the presumptive Democratic candidate in this presidential election. Now, the problem here, and again, just to review, the single biggest issue being debated among the American people was the annexation of Texas. It would be smart for both of these presumptive candidates to have a position on that issue. What is interesting is that neither of these candidates were willing to take a position on the annexation of Texas. Both of these candidates believed that if they focused on this issue of Texas, that it would be too divisive for the nation. They would rather focus on other issues and ignore the Texas issue because the Texas issue involved the expansion of slavery, and they have already seen and understood that every time we debate the expansion of slavery, the country goes through a very heated and emotional time period. So both of these presumptive candidates ignored the issue of Texas altogether. Now, in 1844, the Whig Party did in fact nominate Henry Clay as their candidate, but it was the Democrats that were divided over who would be their candidate. Again, it was presumed that it would be Martin Van Buren, but that did not happen. That's where we enter into the story of the Democratic National Convention of 1844. Again, it was believed that Martin Van Buren would easily win the nomination for the Democratic Party, but what we find at the 44 Democratic Convention is that he failed to do so. After 8 ballots to determine who would be the nominee for the Democratic Party in 1844, after 8 ballots, the Democrats ultimately decided on a man named James K. Polk from Kentucky. And after 8 ballots, he ends up winning the Democratic nomination for the President of the United States. So the election came down then to Polk or Henry Clay. Now let me briefly explain why Polk ended up winning this nomination. Polk ran on a platform in 1844 of Manifest Destiny. Now, what Manifest Destiny was it was kind of a religious movement, but it was also just kind of a nationalistic movement. And what it meant was, Americans could look at a map of North America and they could see all that land out to the west. And for many Americans, it just became obvious to them. It just became manifest that they should expand there. And added into this was kind of a sense of inevitability, that not only should Americans go here, that it was obvious we should go here, that it was manifest that we should go here, but that it was actually that God had ordained us to do it, that we were destined to do this. And what made him popular in the 1844 Democratic Convention and later on in the election was that this was his platform. He would give speeches that fit in line with this belief of manifest destiny, that the United States should expand west. So this is what ultimately won him the 1844 Democratic nomination, and in the end, it's going to be what allows him to win the 1844 presidential election. And you can see that this was not a blowout election for Polk, but it was a pretty decisive one. Polk will win the presidential election of 1844 by an electoral vote of 170 to 105. Now, this is largely explained because Polk was willing to take a stance on the issue of the annexation of Texas, something I'll talk about here in a second. That whole idea was wrapped up in this nationalistic religious fervor that was taking place in the United States that we know as Manifest Destiny. And since Clay was not willing to talk about any of this type of stuff, you would not have seen any type of Manifest Destiny in any of Clay's speeches during this presidential campaign. And so the election was easily then won by Polk because he was touching on what the American people were feeling. And again, that belief of Manifest Destiny. So real quick, so that's the presumptive candidates, that's Polk, and that's this idea of Manifest Destiny. What's then significant about the election of 1844? Well, a few things. Polk believed that his election to the presidency was a mandate from the people to fulfill Manifest Destiny. He believed then that his election to the presidency of the United States represented the people, giving him a mandate to go ahead and expand. And of course, the first way to do that was to go ahead and annex Texas. The other reason this election of 1844 was significant is that this is going to set the United States down the road to war with Mexico, which I will explain here in just this few seconds. Another reason the election of 1844 was significant is that this election saw the nation's first dark horse candidate to ever win the presidency. Sorry for the typo there. What I mean by a dark horse candidate is that Polk was a guy that very few Americans knew anything about, and he kind of came out of nowhere in 1844 to not only win the Democratic nomination, but ultimately to win the presidency. Now, there had been dark horse candidates before in American history, but none of them had ever won the presidency, and he was really our nation's first candidate to do so. So that's kind of an interesting part of this election. It's something that had never really happened before in American history. What we really care about is how Polk saw this election as a mandate by the people to annex Texas, to fulfill Manifest Destiny, and it's this election that kind of sets events in motion that are going to lead to the Mexican-American War. Okay, so we've talked about the election of 1844 and this idea of manifest destiny as kind of being some leading causes of the Mexican War. Let's briefly then talk about the annexation of Texas real quick. Now, trust me, Polk was absolutely going to annex Texas. He actually didn't get the chance. The president that was in office before Polk, a man by the name of John Tyler, realizing the way the political winds were blowing in the United States, actually got Congress to pass a joint resolution towards the very end of his term in office. And so Texas was actually annexed before Polk took office. Now, that's just mincing words. Polk most certainly would have done this anyway, but he didn't get the chance. Regardless, on February 19th, 1846, Texas was annexed by the United States and it became a state of the Union. Now, this was problematic for the United States because Mexico had already told the United States that if they annexed Texas, they would consider this an act of war. And so on February 19th, when the United States annexed Texas, the Mexican government let it be known that a state of war now exists between the United States and Mexico. But that's not the full story. The annexation of Texas really sets things in motion, picking up after the election of 1844. What really sparked the war was a dispute over the boundaries of Texas. So let me kind of explain what I mean by this. You can see on this map that the part of Texas that was incorporated into the United States is that area in gray here. Let me pull up my pen. This area here. This was the part of what we know of today as Texas that was actually annexed to the United States. Now this area here in pink, this was land that Texas had claimed as a result of the Texas Revolution. And once Texas was annexed to the United States, a dispute instantly arose between the United States and Mexico over the borders of Texas. The United States claimed that the borders of Texas was everything north of the Rio Grande River. Mexico claimed that no, the border of Texas and the border then of the United States and Mexico was actually the Nueces River, which was a little further north from the Rio Grande. So as soon as Texas is annexed, there instantly arose this dispute between Mexico and the United States over the borders of Texas and Mexico. And this is what's really going to spark off the war. What Polk decided to do once he was inaugurated is that he ordered the general of the United States Army, a man by the name of Zachary Taylor, who was in New Orleans, Louisiana at the time. He ordered Zachary Taylor to move a large United States Army to Corpus Christi, Texas, which was right on the Nueces River. Now, Polk ordered Taylor to do this so that it doesn't start a war immediately. He knows that if he orders Taylor further south, that it likely will start a war. But he does want to put Taylor in a position in case war does begin. We will be in a position to wage it. Now, at the same time Polk ordered Zachary Taylor to the Nueces River, Polk sent a diplomat to Mexico City, a man by the name of John Slidell. And Slidell's mission to Mexico City was to try to negotiate some type of diplomatic solution in order to prevent a war. Well, John Slidell's mission to Mexico City failed. The Mexican government told him they are not willing to negotiate anything. They believe that the Nueces River is the border between Texas and Mexico, and they are not willing to budge on this. So Slidell wrote a letter back to Polk informing him that his mission had failed. It's at this point that Polk ordered General Zachary Taylor to move his army south to the Rio Grande River. Now, to the Mexican government, this was seen as an invasion of Mexican territory. So the tension here is ramped up tremendously now. The potential for conflict, the potential for an outbreak of an actual war is very high. And you can see on this map that Taylor moved his army from Corpus Christi down to around Port Isabel and established the fort that he called Fort Brown. And it's down here on the border of the Rio Grande that everything blows wide open. A patrol of the United States Army, receiving intelligence that the Mexican army was operating north of the Rio Grande River, was dispatched from Fort Brown to investigate. And one of these U.S. Army patrols was ambushed by Mexican soldiers north of the Rio Grande River. 11 American soldiers were killed in this ambush, and the force of about 80 cavalrymen, those that survived, were of course captured. Now, Taylor sends word to President Polk of what has occurred here north of the Rio Grande River. Polk's actions then are to go in front of the United States Congress, and he gave an address to Congress on May 11th, 1846, and I've pulled out the most important portion of this address. You can see that he informs Congress that Mexico has passed the boundary of the United States, has invaded our territory, and shed American blood upon American soil. She has proclaimed that hostilities have commenced and that the two nations are now at war. It was during this address to Congress that Polk was seeking a declaration of war, and on that day, May 11, 1846, Congress declared war on Mexico. This is how the Mexican War began. It was a process that really began with the Texas Revolution, picked up steam as a result of the election of 1844, picked up even more steam because Americans were pretty fervent in their belief of manifest destiny and a willingness to expand. Polk then's aggressive maneuvers of not only annexing Texas, of course Tyler did that, but sending Taylor into the disputed border region. This is what's going to cause the war. And what we want to do now is kind of focus on the major campaigns and the major battles of this war. Now look, the Mexican War is a very large-scale war. It takes place over a huge area of land. I just kind of want to talk about some of the major campaigns, but then focus really just on the most important of them. This war will be waged in what is today California. It'll be waged in northern Mexico and also in central Mexico. And the map you see on the screen here is kind of a big, broad overview of the entire war. I'm going to briefly talk about the campaign that took place in California and also the campaign that took place in northern Mexico, but we're going to focus most exclusively on the southern campaign in central Mexico. As soon as war was declared, the United States military invaded the southwest portion of North America, and by early 1847, the United States military had captured from Mexico all of what is today known as California. Now this will come into play later on at the end of the war, but this was kind of one of the campaigns of the Mexican War, a campaign to seize control of California. Now the reason the United States wanted California was they do not know that there's gold there yet. The gold rush will come later. The reason the Americans want California is because of all the ports along the Pacific Ocean that California has. Ports like San Francisco, which was a very deep water port and allowed then the expansion of United States commerce into the Pacific Ocean. So as soon as the war was declared, the United States invaded the Southwest, and by early 1847 had captured what is today California. There was also, though, a campaign waged by General Zachary Taylor in northern Mexico. And let me just kind of briefly talk about what happened here. You know, after the ambush of Taylor's army and after the invasion of California, well, in the fall of 1846, General Taylor was ordered to go ahead and invade northern Mexico, which he did. He crosses the Rio Grande River. He is immediately engaged by the Mexican army, which is actually led by Santa Anna. He scores two enormous victories at the Battle of Monterrey and also at the Battle of Buena Vista. Now, what happened next was very interesting and kind of petty. After these two big victories for General Taylor at Monterrey and Buena Vista, Taylor is now becoming kind of a household name for Americans. He is now being looked at as a hero of this war. And this made President Polk a little nervous. The reason for that is that Zachary Taylor was a Whig. Polk was a Democrat. And what Polk was worried about here is that if Zachary Taylor keeps moving and keeps scoring big victories, that Taylor may represent a rival for him in the 1848 presidential election. So while General Taylor is having a lot of success in northern Mexico, Polk actually orders Taylor to halt after the Battle of Buena Vista. And all the resources of the United States military were diverted away from General Taylor and diverted in early 1847 to a man named General Winfield Scott. His nickname was Old Fuss and Feathers. Here's a great picture of him. Now, he may not look like much, but General Scott was an incredible military strategist. Now, the reason all the military resources were diverted to General Scott is that Scott was a Democrat. So for Polk, this was politically safe to give him the opportunity to win the war rather than letting General Taylor do so. Now, in early 1847, after all these military resources are diverted to General Scott begins preparing for an invasion of central Mexico. And that's the theater of the war, the campaign that we really want to focus on, because this was where the war was won. Here's a big, broad overview of General Scott's invasion of central Mexico. It all began by the invasion of a coastal city in Mexico known as Veracruz. Veracruz was the key to controlling Mexico. It became then the target. If the United States Army could control Veracruz, it would be able to isolate and cut off Mexico from all resupply from outside nations. So at Veracruz was where the invasion by General Scott began. Interesting enough, this was actually the first amphibious invasion in American history. That was largely done without much resistance, nothing like what you'll see later on in, say, World War II and later on in other wars of American history. But Veracruz will quickly fall to the American military, and from Veracruz, General Scott's army will begin its long march across central Mexico, the target being the Mexican capital of Mexico City. Now, between March and September of 1847, General Scott's army will slug its way through the mountains of central Mexico. By September of 1847, it is at the gates of Mexico City, and it's right outside Mexico City that the decisive battle and the decisive moment of this war took place. In order for the United States to capture Mexico City, they needed to capture the high ground around the city. And the high ground was dominated by a Mexican military academy. The high ground was known as the Chapultepec, and there's a depiction of this battle with the Chapultepec in the background. Now, this was the decisive battle of the war. It was an extremely bloody battle. A lot of Americans lost their lives here. But at the end of the day, the Chapultepec fell to the American military, and this was the decisive moment of the war. With the fall of Chapultepec, there was now nothing standing in the way of General Scott's army and the capture and the seizing of Mexico City. So, in September of 1847, the United States military will capture the capital of Mexico, and the war will be over. These were the major battles, the major campaigns of the Mexican-American War. Now, what we need to discuss is the treaty that ends this war. It took a while for Winfield Scott to find enough representatives of the Mexican government to be able to negotiate a treaty with them. In fact, it took nearly a year to do so. He finally was able to cobble together enough representatives of the Mexican government to negotiate with, where he found many of them hiding in a small town north of Mexico City that is known as Guadalupe Hidalgo. And that's why the treaty that ends the Mexican-American War is named for this. So what were the major terms of this treaty? Well, the ones we really care about is the first one. As part of this treaty, Mexico agreed to cede over, meaning hand over ownership, of over 500,000 square miles of territory to the United States. I'm going to show you a map here in a second, but it's virtually everything from Texas to the Pacific Ocean in what is today the United States. This 500,000 square mile tract of territory, it's known as the Mexican Cession. And you can see it's this area in light yellow here. All of this land was ceded over to the United States, meaning the United States now owns it. It's theirs. It's referred to as the Mexican Cession, and it was a gigantic portion of land won here by the United States as a result of the war and came to the United States as a result of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Another term of the treaty that's interesting is that the United States agreed to give the Mexican government $15 million. This was done for a couple reasons. It was done so that the Mexican government could reestablish itself, could regain control of its nation, so that the United States wouldn't have to worry about a destabilized Mexico south of its border. But it was also done to alleviate some of the guilt the United States felt as a result of this war. You know, this war went very well for the United States, and it resulted in Mexico losing half of its territory. So this was a way for the United States to kind of alleviate some of the guilt that it felt as a result of the war. The term we really care about, though, is that first one, the Mexican Cession. And that leads me into a discussion of why the Mexican War was significant to American history. So let's focus on then. What is significant about the Mexican-American War of 46-48? What should you take away from this? What's important? What should you know about all this? Well, a few things. Two kind of minor things, but they're worth knowing anyway. In terms of the numbers of soldiers engaged in this war for the United States, and in terms of the resultant casualties the United States faced in this war, it actually turns out that the Mexican War was the deadliest war in American history. And what I mean by that is that I don't mean more Americans died in this war. What I mean is that when you take the number of soldiers that were involved in this war and compare it to the number of casualties that resulted from this war, what I mean is that if you served in this war, you stood a higher chance of dying in this war than in any other war in American history. So it makes it the deadliest war, the most lethal war in American history. I think that's kind of worth knowing. It's interesting. Most people don't know much about the Mexican War. They always think World War II or the Civil War was the deadliest war in terms of number of soldiers involved. It turns out it's the Mexican War. The other reason the Mexican War was significant is that a lot of the officers of the U.S. Army that waged this war ended up becoming the future leaders of the American Civil War. Men like Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, Jubal Early, Judah P. Benjamin, Stonewall Jackson, all these future leaders of the American Civil War for both the Confederacy and the Union first learned how to wage a war because of their involvement in the Mexican War. So everything they learned about waging war, moving armies, how to set up tactics and strategy, they learned from the Mexican War. And that's kind of worth knowing because this is one reason the American Civil War will be so deadly, will be so lethal. It's because the leaders of that war already had a lot of experience in waging war. But what we really care about in terms of the significance of the Mexican War was the acquisition of the Mexican Cession. The acquisition of all of that new territory raised the question of slavery's expansion into those territories. Now, the question of slavery's expansion, if you remember, this is the question that leads to the American Civil War. And so, we thought we solved this thing in 1820, but here it is again. We have acquired new territory, and we are going to have another debate inside the United States about whether or not slavery is allowed to go to the Mexican Cession. Now, we're going to cover this aspect more in part 3 of this unit, but the acquisition of the Mexican Cession as a result of the Mexican War was an enormously significant result of this war, and the one that we care about the most in terms of the theme of this lecture. So these are kind of the reasons you should know about the Mexican War, some of the more important aspects and the effect the war had on American history. And to prove my point, the great American poet, Ralph Waldo Emerson, he saw very clearly, just like many other Americans did during the Mexican War, what effect this war would have on the United States. He was famous for having this quote, in which he predicted that the United States would in fact conquer Mexico, but that it would be as a man swallows the arsenic, and he predicted that Mexico would poison us. And what he meant by that is he realized this war was likely to result in the acquisition of a lot of territory for the United States, and he realized that the United States was likely going to debate once again whether or not slavery can go here. And he understood, like many, that when we have this debate, things can get out of hand. So we'll talk more about that in part 3, but this go ahead and concludes part 2. I hope you enjoyed this discussion on the Mexican War. I hope you learned a little bit about it. In part 3, we're going to discuss how the results of that war and the other issues are going to create a sectional crisis by the late 1840s.